everyone. We are so excited to have you here with us this evening. This is our second Plato virtual event. Some of you, I see some familiar faces from our event last month, and I'm so happy to see you all again, and lots of new faces. So welcome, welcome, welcome. Today's event, Why Kids Are Good for Philosophy, is going to be a rich, engaging panel discussion, and then we're going to have a conversation afterwards based on all of the questions that you all raise. So I just wanted to start us off by introducing Plato a little bit, tell you a little bit about the format of the event, and introduce our moderator, Allison, who will then introduce the panelists. So several of you, of course, are already Plato members. So it's so great to see you all. And I know several of you are new here and are not Plato members. So Plato is a national organization that does a lot of work in the field of public philosophy and pre-college philosophy. And we do this in several different ways. If you go onto our website, we have resources like the Educator's Toolkit. We have other resources on how to start a program. We also have two journals that we publish. One is Questions that features student work, and one is a peer-reviewed journal called P4. We also host a conference, and our next conference is next year in June 2022 in Seattle. We would love to see you all there. And for those of you who are not members of Plato, we would love to have you as members as part of our organization, and also feel free to follow us on social media where we share a lot of resources. And that's a really quick introduction to Plato for those of you who are new. Feel free to write to us and get in touch with any questions you may have or how else you can be involved. And yeah, I mean, I've been part of Plato for several years, and it's been just such an enriching place to be. And I hope you all will also find that with your increased involvement as we go along. So for today's event, I would like to introduce Allison Cohen, Plato's president and today's moderator. Allison, would you like to take it away? But before I do, I always forget housekeeping. Quick couple of notes on housekeeping. As you all know, this meeting is being recorded and you consented to that. The second point is to make sure that your videos and your mics remain muted and your videos remain off. In order to make sure that visually we only see the folks who are speaking, a good way to do that is to hide non-video participants. So I will just make sure you all know how to use that setting. If you see the little caret symbol right next to stop video, you can go to video settings from there, scroll down and just check off the little box that says hide non-video participants. I'm gonna give everyone a few seconds to just make sure that you have that. And if you have any questions, just come off of mute and let me know and I can direct you again. So there's a little caret next to stop video, go to video settings and just check off hide non-video participants. So that way you should only be seeing people on your screen whose videos are on. Everyone else should be off your screen. Will, you don't see stop video? It's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There's a taskbar at the bottom of your screen and it's towards the left. There should be something that says video or video settings or the image of a video camera. Wendy, did you see it? For those of you using a Mac, I believe it might be in a different location, but there should be an image of a video or something that says video. Oh, it's the same place. Okay, so bottom left. It will say start video if your video is not currently on. Okay, great. And the last thing is Kate will just put in the chat a link to a Google form. That's where we're going to be collecting questions for this evening. All of you should have access to that link, and that is where you will type in your questions, and all of us will be able to look at your questions and make sure that we get to as many as we can in the second half of our session today. Marisa, do we need to? Yes, right. Under video settings, there's stop video participants. Okay, great. I think we're good to go. If you have any questions or are still struggling with any of those things, feel free to send us a chat and we will make sure we troubleshoot. All right, so Allison, handing it over to you. Thank you for moderating today. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, Debbie. And welcome, everyone. Yes, welcome to our second webinar. We're very excited to have you all here. And so once again, just to reiterate, if you have a question that you would like to ask one of the panelists during the Q&A portion of this webinar, if you could please submit that in the Google form. And Kate is going to help us out by posting that link one more time, just so it's fresh in the chat. The Google form is where you will type your question, and we will get to as many of those as we possibly can at the end. We were a little blown away by the number of people who registered for this event, and it's such a pleasure to have you all here. So without further ado, I also apologize for my lighting. It's normally this room is fine for lighting, but apparently this time of day, of course not. So it is my absolute pleasure to welcome our three panelists tonight. And I will be introducing each of them. Jenna Morlone is the founder and director of the University of Washington Center for Philosophy for Children, an academic research center dedicated to research and practice in philosophy for children and philosophy of childhood, an affiliate associate professor of philosophy. Her book, Seen and Not Heard, has just been published, and she is also the author of The Philosophical Child, co-author of the textbook Philosophy and Education, Questioning and Dialogue in Schools, co-editor of Philosophy and Education, Introducing Philosophy to Young People, and she has written numerous articles about children's philosophical thinking. She is the founding president of PLATO, and was the founding editor-in-chief of the journal Questions, Philosophy for Young People. Jana, welcome, and thank you so much for coming tonight.
Happy to be here.
Next, we have Maughn Rollins Gregory. He is professor of educational foundations at Montclair State University, where he succeeded Matthew Lippman as the director of the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children in 2001. He publishes and teaches in the areas of philosophy of education, philosophy for children, pragmatism, gender studies, and Socratic and contemplative pedagogies. He is co-editor of the Routledge International Handbook of Philosophy for Children and the Routledge series Philosophy for Children Founders. He is currently serving as the inaugural research coordinator for the International Council of Philosophical Inquiry with Children. He also serves as Vice President for Personnel and Grievance Officer for the American Federation of Teachers, Local 1904. Megan Jane Laverty, welcome, Maughn. Welcome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Very happy to be here.
And last but certainly not least, Megan Jane Laverty is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. Her primary research interests are the history of philosophy of education, moral philosophy and its significance for education, and philosophy with children and adolescents in schools. Megan has written widely on these themes. Together with Maughn, she edits the Routledge series Philosophy for Children Founders, which includes In Community of Inquiry with Anne Margaret Sharp, Childhood, Philosophy, and Education, and Gareth B. Matthews, The Child's Philosopher. Welcome, Megan. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
And so when we were thinking about tonight's webinar, we were sort of having this internal discussion that so much of what we do at PLATO centers around this idea of how to do philosophy with children and young adults and why it is good for kids. And this discussion tonight that we're about to have is about raising the often ignored question, well, why are kids good for philosophy? So we're going to dig right in and tackle that very big question. And so, Jana, I'd like to address the first question to you. What do children bring to philosophy? And what is missing when we ignore children's potential contributions?
Well, I'm going to start by saying that I'm just so happy to be here with Megan and Maughn, who are such delightful and cherished colleagues, and whose wonderful book about Gareth Matthews is just about to be published. I'm especially happy because Gary, along with Matt Lipman, was one of my earliest mentors. And he was talking long before anyone else about why children are good for philosophy. In my recent experience writing Seen and Not Heard, I began thinking a lot about the ways we talk about philosophy for children. We tend to emphasize why philosophy is valuable for children: critical thinking, enhanced confidence and skill in expressing their views, experience in civil dialogue, and a deepened awareness of the multiplicity of perspectives in the world, a space for exploring issues of interest to children, the development of philosophical sensitivity, etc. And all of these are important, of course. And they help us to convince people that this work matters, which, as many of us know, is not always an easy task. But as I was working on the book and listening to recordings of philosophy classes I'd had with kids and reviewing notes about and transcripts of conversations, I thought a lot about how much adults have to learn from children, how much I have learned from children, and about the ways that the lived experience of childhood, what philosopher John Wall calls children's openness and relationality to the world, leads children to bring distinctive gifts to philosophical engagement. And I don't think we talk enough about this. In a conversation about childhood a few years ago, a 9-year-old child said, quote, "Childhood is not just about becoming an adult. It's a time of its own. What happens to kids affects our whole lives. That's just not true for adults. I think what we experience, we feel more deeply, and it stays with us." And I think there's something to this idea that children experience life more deeply, that there is an emotional immediacy to childhood and a kind of an embodied attentiveness to living that seems to fade for most people as we get older. Perhaps in part because children are relatively new to the world, what eventually seems mundane and goes unnoticed by adults is vividly present and even extraordinary for children. They exhibit what is sometimes referred to as beginner's mind, a way of approaching experience with a fresh and receptive perspective. Writer John Banville refers to childhood as a, quote, "state of constantly recurring astonishment." Children have a boundless sense of wonder, and they're eager to learn everything they can about the world. And I think that this leads to greater, what I've called epistemic openness. Children are less burdened by assumptions about everything they think they already know. And so they seem more willing to entertain new and imaginative and unfamiliar possibilities, which is really important for philosophy and for life in general, I think. And we as adults can be kind of let into this orientation if we listen to and take seriously what children have to say. In their introduction to the volume about Gareth Matthews, Megan and Maughn write, quote, "Few have claimed, as Matthews did, that adults have much to learn from children in terms of some of our most serious endeavors, thinking and living well. He fervently wished for adults and children to experience, quote, that wonderfully strange mode of inquiry in which grown-ups cannot control the outcome or rely on the advantage of age and experience to maintain their position," end quote. I find that children often focus in on kind of the elemental philosophical questions of life, such as whether life has any meaning, the significance of death, what's most important in being alive. A few years ago, I was doing a program for a group of parents, and one of the parents said that her 3-year-old child kept asking her, "Mommy, why do the days keep coming?" And this question has haunted me ever since. I think it's such a powerful expression of the mystery of time and the feelings we have about living a mortal life. And I've observed that children approach philosophical topics from a point of view that's almost always grounded in personal experience in very explicit ways. They tend to bring together the emotional and the philosophical. the questions that matter to them come from what's going on in their lives. So for example, a conversation I had that was begun by some 10-year-old children raising the issue of the ethics of attending birthday parties. This is a longer conversation that I write about in Seen and Not Heard, so I'll just give you a snapshot, which goes as follows. Jade, it's okay to want to be alone. If your friend is having a birthday party, and it's not like you don't like them or anything, but you don't want to go. You're not trying to hurt their feelings. You just don't want to spend time at that, and so you don't. Noah, I actually disagree with that. You don't do that. It's your friend and it's their birthday. You don't just say, oh, I can't go to your birthday party because I want to be alone. You don't do that. It's your friend, so it's worth it. You don't just miss something like that. Beth, if you just feel kind of lonely and down, and it's a birthday party with a lot of people, or even not a lot of people, but you just don't feel like working yourself up to it, if you want to be alone, then if they're a really good friend, they'll probably understand. Scarlett, I would feel disappointed and sad if a friend didn't come to my party, but I would think they probably had a good reason. It might not be as much fun without them, but I should respect them. So this conversation really led me to rethink my own expectations of friendship, because I'm one of those people who thinks you always show up for your friends' events. I kind of agree with Noah. You don't just miss something like that. But as I've been thinking about it, I realized, well, it's one thing for me to say, I'm always going to show up to my friends' events because I love social events. It's another thing for me to expect my friends to always show up for mine. Because if a friend really wants to stay at home and doesn't want to attend an important event in my life, not because she doesn't care about me, but because it's uncomfortable for some reason, shouldn't I want her to do what's best for her rather than do what I would like her to do? Isn't that really what being a friend is all about? And so on this and many, many other topics, children's ideas and insights have changed the way I think. I think because they bring to philosophy a willingness to engage just honestly and forthrightly, often without filter, with passion and imagination and openness. Listening to them in what Gary Matthews called a, quote, relationship of mutual respect, end quote, I love that phrase, can enliven and expand our philosophical universe. I often think about a comment a child once made, so much more is possible than we think. And doing philosophy with children always reminds me that I can be unafraid to try out ideas that might seem far-fetched or naive or simple, and that possibility is alive in the world.
Thank you so much, Jana. And now I'd love to open it up to Megan and Maughn to respond to that, to offer their thoughts.
Megan, do you want to go first?
No, I'm happy for you to go first. That was lovely, Jana. I just enjoyed listening to you speak about it.
Thank you, Megan.
Yeah, I did too. That was really beautiful, Jana. And I love the way you distinguished a number of different gifts that children bring to doing philosophy that are, if not unique to children, they are certainly more abundant in children, or maybe come more naturally to children. That's something Gareth Matthews, a way he put it. Some of these gifts come more naturally to children and they get harder for adults for reasons of socialization and other kinds of reasons. And I was also thinking that maybe another thing that children bring to philosophy is a set of questions and concerns. I'm thinking content-wise, like questions and concerns about life that are, again, if not unique to childhood, are particularly salient in childhood. And I'm thinking sometimes some of these concerns are concerns they share with adults, like what does it mean to be a friend? That beautiful example that you just gave. What does it mean to be a friend, and how do we understand death? These are things that are important, I think, at every life stage. But I also think that there are probably a number of questions and concerns, philosophical questions, philosophical concerns that are unique perhaps to young childhood that will not be salient after that. And yet, at that point in life, they're very salient, they're very important, and they're clearly philosophical.
You know, it reminds me, I just had a conversation with a group of kids about whether you can love a stuffed animal.
There you go.
And yeah.
Perfect. And I think certainly probably the same for teenagers, right? For young adults, for the elderly, for different people at different phases in their lifestyle, there are probably questions that, if not are exclusive to that period of life, are maybe almost exclusive. And if they're not doing philosophy around them at that point in their life, and if we're not sort of helping them do that and take an interest in that, then I think that's a huge loss. I'm done.
As a high school teacher, I was going to ask you about how that analysis applies to high school students, or how you think it applies to high school students. Have we already done enough to jade them by that time, or do you think that there are still unique insights that they can offer to this grand, series of questions?
I think so. I think high school students are grappling with questions around identity in particular in powerful ways that don't really get repeated in quite the same way after that time in life. It would be one example.
I think that's right. I think Gareth Matthews, most of what I say tonight, by the way, is going to be coming from this book that Megan and I have that Jana so nicely mentioned on Gareth Matthews' work. Most of his work was with younger children. Almost all of his work was with younger children. And this is something Megan and I thought about. And he did write in a few places about this danger of socialization, and he talked particularly about the, Megan, what did he call it? The not the right answers, but the useful answers. Was that what he said? That you learn how to give the useful answers and ask the useful questions in school. And by the time you're in high school, you're pretty good at that. If you're doing at all well in high school, you've become pretty good at that. And it's sort of like the better you become at asking and answering those useful kinds of questions, the further away you get from what we're talking about.
And I think the harder it becomes to not be self-conscious about asking an unuseful question.
So important.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because I think Gareth Matthews talks about how you become less inclined to ask those questions. And so you have to kind of rediscover the impulse, the wonder and the awe. But he doesn't talk about a certain self-consciousness, but I think that's right, for those students who still want to ask those questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question, can you love a stuffed animal, for example, is actually a really interesting philosophical question. But I know that when I was in graduate school, there was no way I was raising my hand and asking that question.
What this conversation we're having right now is relevant to this concern I know the three of us share. I think maybe most people in philosophy for children share about philosophy for children being co-opted by a certain kind of educational agenda, which Megan and I have referred to as the neoliberal educational agenda, where, as Jana said, thinking about philosophy is good for thinking skills, good for like raising your test scores. There's something very problematic about that, that sort of moves in the direction we're talking about now, away from what's genuinely philosophical, and makes it possible for young children and for teenagers to ask these kinds of questions.
Yeah, because it kind of strips away everything we've just talked about that children bring to philosophy, and that's so wonderful about doing philosophy with children, and turns philosophy into, another critical thinking program or something, which would be so unfortunate, because then all of the things that we find, at least for me, have the most depth, can get lost.
I finished a beautiful book by Wendell Berry this week, and I underlined this question he had: how do we talk back to, he used the word industrialism. What language do we use to talk back to industrialism when it has sort of eclipsed all other languages? And he's particularly talking about the languages of the humanities, like the language of history, the language of philosophy, the language of the arts, right? But we need to somehow recultivate the ability to speak in those languages, especially when we have to speak to scientists, to politicians, to educators who may be infused with this industrialist mentality.
Yeah, it makes me think about kind of the emancipatory quality of philosophy and how being willing to think in these sort of freely imaginative ways that look at possibilities that we often, as we grow up, decide are just impossible and not even worth thinking about. And I think one of the things philosophy does is to open the door to those, because a good reason for not thinking about something in philosophy is never because that's not possible. You have to kind of give a better reason than that. And often, you know, once you start to think about it, you think, well, maybe actually it is possible, or at least conceivable.
And I think it opens the scope of what we care about, like what we cherish, what we think is most important and vital about life, right? What's worth living for. It really broadens that for me.
And that actually is really, I think, what kids bring to philosophy, because they, at least in my experience, kids are so close to this question of like, what matters? Why should we live? I want to live my life so that it matters. I want to do things that matter to me, and what does matter to me. And because they're not sort of taken up with all the details of daily life, they can really, you know, hone in on these questions in a way that I think, for at least for me, working with kids is so helpful and brings me right into that space in a way I might not ordinarily have access to.
Wonderful. And so, Maughn, the next question is for you, our sort of next guiding question, which I think is a natural follow-up to the first, and that is, why do you think philosophy has excluded children? And I'm wondering if in your response, you could also speak a little bit about how the childhood development model might limit our recognition of children's philosophical capacities.
Thank you. Yeah. So this is something that Gary Matthews focused on throughout his career. He wrote. I was looking at this question. He wrote his first essay addressing this was in 1978, and his last essay addressing this was in 2009, shortly before he died. So this is a question that really occupied him for most of his career. So first of all, I'll say a few words about this child development model, what that even is. Just a brief background about this. And Gareth traced it back to Aristotle. Of course, Gareth was ancient philosophy was his area of specialization as a philosopher. And he wrote that Aristotle was one of his favorite philosophers, but he was very critical about Aristotle's philosophy of childhood. So for Aristotle, adulthood is the final cause of childhood. Adulthood is what childhood is aiming for. So the adult is what a child is meant to become. And so children are essentially pre-adults. That's how we understand children. They don't have a full-fledged humanity in and of themselves. They will have full-fledged humanity once they become adults, but as children, they don't. There's nothing about what it means to be a child that isn't already subsumed by what it means to be an adult. This is for Aristotle. So, for example, two of the biggest interests of Matthews about children were art and philosophy. He thought that those were two things that a lot of children naturally do better than most adults do. But on the developmental model, a child's abilities in art and philosophy are only interesting and only valuable because it may lead them to become actual artists and actual philosophers as adults. So Matthews called this the deficit model of childhood, meaning that children are inherently deficit as compared to adults, intellectually, morally, in terms of self-control, language, you name it. And it also, Matthews wrote, talks about Michael Sloat's work on the goods of childhood and the goods of adulthood. And Sloat was saying that basically the authentic goods of a human life happen in adulthood. It's like, he said, like any species, there's a developmental immature process, and then you reach full maturity where you've got all your powers and you realize, and then there's decline after that. So the deficit model of childhood it echoes that. So Matthews focused particularly on developmental psychology and on two branches of that: developmental cognitive psychology and developmental moral psychology. And as most people who know his work know, he focused on the cognitive psychology of Jean Piaget. And for Piaget, children's development was biologically determined, actually, by biological mental structures that matured in set stages. And education doesn't affect those structures because they're biological. They're determined biologically. Our brain matures and our biology matures in such a way that it doesn't matter how much you talk to children or engage them in language play, those structures are set. So they're only able to do certain things at certain points in their life. And of course, for Kohlberg, was a follower of Piaget, and for Kohlberg, you can tell the same story about your moral development. The children's moral capacities are fixed at certain points. Matthews brought two kinds of critiques to their work. He brought methodological critiques. For example, when he said that when Piaget was interviewing children and children would give an unusual or a playful response, Piaget would discount that from the data. He would say that that's not really how typical children understand the world. And so that didn't get included in how he understood children's thinking. And another critique was that a lot of the adult concepts Piaget was using as a standard against which to measure children's understanding were inherently problematic philosophically, like the concept of being alive. Like that's one of the concepts Piaget traces, like young children think of being alive as anything that can move and then anything that can move itself. And then they eventually evolve to the adult conception. But as Matthews points out, there is no sort of shared adult conception of what it means to be alive. And then there were theoretical critiques. One of the biggest ones was Piaget's concept of concept displacement, that as children move through different stages, they replace old inferior concepts with new improved concepts. And Matthews actually came up with an alternative model that Jen Glaser writes about in the book of development. It's not a biological model, it's a language-based model. And it focuses on concept development. And basically it's that as soon as children begin participating in a language community, they latch on to paradigms of those concepts like cat, or the moral paradigm of lying, what it means to tell a lie, simple concepts. And then over time, as they get more experience and mostly as their language gets more sophisticated and they use those concepts in a number of different contexts, they get more sophisticated about the concept, but they don't lose those initial paradigms. So that's a really important difference. And then more broadly, Matthews offered an alternative model to the deficit model. Almost to the end of his career, he came up with what he called the mirror image model of childhood and adulthood. And I've got a little paragraph I'm going to read to you that kind of explains it succinctly. So this is Matthews writing in 2006. He says, I have suggested that children, if they're given an opportunity to share and discuss their thoughts and ideas, and even encouraged to play some role in structuring their own schooling and family life, can you imagine that, will be able to enrich the lives of their teachers and parents, as well as their own lives. These comments are meant to point in the direction of a more balanced conception of childhood. In place of a purely deficit conception of childhood, where the aim of living is just for the children to grow up and become normal adults, I suggest that we should try to develop a mirror image conception of childhood. As a crude but perhaps helpful generalization, we can say that the strengths of childhood tend to be the weaknesses of adulthood and vice versa. Thus, children have fresh eyes to see what most of us adults no longer see, curiosity to understand what we take for granted, and minds that detect puzzles, incongruities, and perplexities that we have, most of us long ago, become inured to. We adults, on the other hand, have lots of information, many sophisticated skills, deeper understanding about some matters, and much experience to share about how to negotiate the challenges of life. The point, and I love this last sentence, the point of good parenting and good schooling should be to help our children gain some of our adult advantages without losing as many childhood advantages as most of us adults have already lost. Well, that's the end of the quote. I think there's just one more point I wanted to make. That one thing that Megan and I discovered in doing this book was that Matthews had a fairly unique understanding of what philosophy is, what it means to do philosophy. And I think that's relevant to what we're talking about. For Matthews, philosophy is most fundamentally about the ability to be gripped by what he called perplexities. Perplexities about that are common to human experience, perplexities about things that other people take for granted. And he drew that largely from his work on Socrates and Plato. But he believed that children and adults are both susceptible to this kind of experience of being gripped by a philosophical perplexity and then doing something with it. And as Jana has said beautifully, that children tend to do that more imaginatively and more playfully and take more risks in doing that than most adults do. So that adult philosophers even have to cultivate the kind of naivety that children have in order to be able to be, once again, gripped by those kinds of perplexities. But this is why Matthews keeps emphasizing the importance of intergenerational philosophical dialogue, because while everyone is susceptible to this kind of perplexity and everyone's capable of doing philosophical inquiry, certain parts of it come easier to children and certain parts of that come easier to adults. So while everybody is qualified and able to do it, nobody should think we can do it alone. We need people with these different kinds of gifts that come at different ages and different kinds of experiences to come together and have intergenerational dialogue.
That was really interesting. Thank you, Maughn. Jana, Megan?
Megan, do you want to start?
No, I'm happy for you to start, Jana.
Well, I was just thinking about, I mean, the deficit model, I think, is really important. Gary's idea of this deficit model of childhood, what sometimes people talk about children as becomings and not full human beings, this kind of Aristotelian idea of the unfinished human being. And it makes me wonder a little bit about the role of ageism in all of this, because I think it's not just that we see children as kind of imperfect human beings or human beings in the making, but it's also that we tend to look at them through this lens that looks primarily at children for how cute or amusing or precocious they are, particularly younger children, and doesn't listen to their words without filtering them through that lens, so that even if a child says exactly the same thing that Megan says, Megan is going to be taken seriously in the way a 7-year-old who says whatever those words are won't be. And I feel like there's a similar dynamic at work with people who are elderly, and similarly who are sort of discounted and ignored, and what they have to say isn't taken seriously. And I've just started to think about this, how this, because I think mostly about children, but I've been thinking about the parallels between both ends of the life spectrum and wondering why it is that we so easily kind of push aside people at various ends of life, and what dynamic is it that leads us to do that. And I think philosophy is kind of in some ways, one of the worst offenders, because philosophy has such a narrow view of who's qualified to do it in the first place. And so it's so easy to just push aside people for various reasons, including those to do with age. What do you think? What do you both think about that? It's kind of a half-formed in some ways thought, but.
Well, I agree. I think that philosophy is one of the worst offenders. And I think it's very significant that Matthews, I think he's sometimes misunderstood or read in a romantic way, like he's romanticizing childhood. He's saying adults are just natural philosophers in a way, or children are natural philosophers, adults aren't, there you go. So I think that's why I picked that paragraph that I read, because he says, no, adults have really important skills and experiences and perspectives that are necessary to doing philosophy that children don't have. And so the intergenerational part is really important. So the kind of respect that you mentioned before, Jana, that this relationship of mutual respect has got to be based on a recognition of different but equally important strengths and perspectives that adults and children bring to the philosophical enterprise.
And it seems like that's the key, the equally important part, because I think that even often people who will say, oh, that is a really interesting thing that those children are talking about, will still think that it's in some ways less important than what the adult philosophers have to say, purely because of the age of the participants. And yeah, so it's interesting.
I think that has both to do with what we talked about earlier, the idea that children are unfinished and that they're not as good at these kinds of things, but also this idea that in the human life, adulthood is like the pinnacle of human life. Like it's where you're fully human as an adult in a way that you will not be fully human at the other ends of the spectrum.
Which is so bizarre when you think about it, because we're constantly changing. And
exactly, yeah, that somehow the concerns and the interests and the perspectives and the needs at those other ends are less fully human, like they're less legitimate in a way. So yeah, it's very problematic.
In what sense, within that context, does it still make sense to say to an adult that they should respond to children in a developmentally appropriate way? Right? When you hear that phrase, and as an educator, right, we hear that phrase a lot. But I think there's a lot of confusion about what that ought to mean. And so I was wondering if the three of you had any observations about that. Loaded question, right? Loaded question. Let's make it fun.
Well, just one thought I have about that from Matthew's perspective, because I think Matthews was very critical of the theories of Piaget and Kohlberg. And I think some people interpreted those criticisms to mean that he was also critical of developmental psychology writ large. And he wasn't. I mean, he did think that it was appropriate for psychologists to study, developmental stages in the life of a person or people. But I think his concern about the developmental theories that he was criticizing is that he made the world of children seems so different from the world of adults. Like maybe the developmental theories were being used to kind of reify a certain kind of ageism, and we're also contributing to that ageism. And so I think he thought that, sort of like Aristotle, I think that if we're going to think about what's developmentally appropriate, it has to be in the context of an understanding that there is a much closer connection between children and adults than we ordinarily assume, that they bring different strengths, and that we want to kind of focus on perhaps the subtleties and the not see, as Maughn said earlier, adulthood as the pinnacle. So also thinking about development differently, like in the context of language and how, we retain certain insights, but learn more, expand our set of paradigms as we age. So I know that's not an answer in terms of what's, how we should think about what's developmentally appropriate, but I think Gareth Matthews would have supported some of the recent developmental psychology that's happening now, that it seems much more sensitive and much less engaged in highlighting great differences between the child and the adult.
Yeah, because I think, I mean, he did say that our views of children are so limited by developmental models because we see children only through this lens, and and especially because those models are so rigid, as you say, Megan, and create this very reified structure between childhood and adulthood. So I think, but I think he would appreciate some of the current work that's being done that's really looking at the strengths of children and has a much different sort of orientation. And I think, I mean, to give an example, Allison, in response to your question, I mean, for example, I mean, of course, there are developmentally appropriate responses to children. If I said to a kindergartner, when we're talking about dreams, well, let me explain to you what Descartes' dream argument is about, and started reciting it, that would be a developmentally inappropriate response to the 5-year-old, who would look at me like, why are you telling me this? And what language are you speaking? But it would equally be an inappropriate response to other people who might have, for different reasons, an equally disinterested attitude towards Descartes' dream argument. So I think the issue is it's really not about so much being developmentally appropriate, it's just being appropriate, kind of reaching people where they are.
Love that. It's not about the fact that they are a child. That same critique could be made. I wouldn't respond the same way to one of my friends as I would the other of my friends, depending on their areas of interest and their areas of study. Yeah, I love that. And I also love the thread of this conversation that had to do with intergenerational discussions and communities of inquiry. And I hope someone asks a question about that. And so I just want to remind people to please put your questions in the Google form. That link is still in the chat. And I'm going to put a plug in for an intergenerational question. But before we get there, Megan, the last question is for you. And that question is, how do we recognize children as full participants in philosophical exchanges? In other words, what does it mean to listen and to take children seriously?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in my response, I'm also going to draw on what I think Matthews would say in response to this question. And I'm also going to echo a lot of what Maughn and Jana have already said. So apologize for that in advance, but it's coming at it in a slightly different way, which I think is really helpful. So I think Matthews would respond to this question by first suggesting that adults listen to children's questions. But I think he thinks that the way for adults to listen to children's questions is to be engaged by the questions themselves. And if adults are engaged by the questions themselves, then they'll not only listen to the children's questions, they'll also want to engage children in discussion, and they'll also listen to what those children have to say, for the reasons, a lot of the reasons that Jana raised at the start. And I think he thinks that this approach allows adults to avoid a certain phoniness that dominates adult interactions with children. And he sees philosophy as a way in which adults and children can avoid that phoniness, because he thinks that the phoniness in adult-child interactions stems from what we've been talking about, which is an adult sense of superiority. Whether that adult sense of superiority is justified, as it is in the case of people who adhere to developmental theory, or whether it's unjustified in the case of ageism. But in either case, listening to children's questions by being engaged by the questions themselves allows us to avoid this phoniness that's introduced by a sense of superiority. And the phoniness, I think, is just that oftentimes we're appearing to engage in conversation, to be conversational partners, to be co-inquirers, when really what the adult thinks they're up to is teaching the child a lesson or moving the child along developmentally, and intervening in those kinds of ways in the child's life. So, as we've talked about, like Matthews does attribute that sense of superiority to developmental theories and to the notion that, to the view that children are members almost of an entirely different culture. And so it's almost impossible that we can share an outlook and attribute to them motivations, interests, questions that are not all that dissimilar from our own. And Cavell talks nicely about this, I think, in the book. And as we've mentioned, it's not just that their ways of thinking are different, it's that their ways of thinking are in some sense inferior, which justifies a certain kind of condescension. And if I think about, Gary Matthews as a kind of crusader, I think one of the things that he was crusading against was adult condescension towards children. He thought this was a particularly pernicious adult vice, and all of us as adults should be involved in working against condescending to people younger than ourselves. And one of the chief ways I think he thought that this could happen, and one of the ways I think I get excited about, for reasons I'm not entirely sure about, is that he said we have to, as adults, begin to see children as living in a conceptual world that's structured similarly to the conceptual world that we as adults inhabit. So I think of these concepts as kind of like ribbons that tie us together in the context of our relationships with one another and our relationships to life. And Maughn talked a little about this when he talked about Matthews' alternative model of development and this idea that we know from philosophy, if from nothing else, that adult conceptions are not unproblematic. And in fact, if you look at the history of philosophy, it's clear that no one has an entirely satisfactory theory of justice. No one has an entirely satisfactory definition of lying. So conceptually, no one has arrived. So that's a sense in which we can really take seriously children if we think of ourselves as engaged in the same conceptual work. Another thing that I love about Matthews that he says in this regard, and I think it's been mentioned by Jana and Maughn, is that children can bring adults back to the basics, the conceptual and moral basics. And the reason they can do that is because they're they are discovering the paradigms of concepts, whether it be shadows or lying or bravery, which is some of the concepts Matthews discusses. And those paradigms are recognized as paradigms of the concept, even though the adult is, however many years older, the adult still recognizes them as paradigmatic. So Matthews gives the example of thinking of a paradigm of lying, misrepresentation to gain advantage, which is what we discover in childhood. So Sonia says She doesn't know what the time is, even though she does really know what the time is. So she's able to watch the rest of the TV program. So he says she doesn't lose that. She'll enlarge her stock of paradigms for what counts as lying, but she'll never lose. She'll always retain those paradigms that she acquired in childhood. So with respect to that, I just want to read what Matthews says about bravery and use it to highlight what I've been talking about in terms of how adults can take children more seriously. He says, from a very young age, our children are admonished to be brave. Yet the notion of bravery is an extremely difficult one to be clear about. I could say that we ought to help our children think about the concept of bravery. But I suspect that most adults, if they are prepared to think freshly with children about what is required for bravery, will learn quite as much from the exercise as the children do. So I will say instead that we and our children ought to help each other think about the concept of bravery and what is brave. And he also, in this context, references the line from Isaiah that says, "A little child shall lead them." And he acknowledges that it can and often is taken sentimentally. And he suggests, though, he wants to resist that and says, no, that's not what I'm intending. He says, I think it expresses a profound truth, namely that adults can learn intellectually and morally from children. And it's this orientation, which informs his mirror image of childhood as well, that I think he thinks invites a sharing of perspectives and an enrichment of both adulthood and childhood. And he thinks that any developmental model that doesn't allow for that possibility is intellectually and morally offensive. So so yeah, I think condescension is something he's really concerned about, trying to work against.
That's wonderful, Megan. Thank you. Thank you. Jana and Maughn, would you like to add your thoughts here?
I just want to just briefly bullet those three attitudes: phoniness, condescension, and sentimentality. That characterize so much of adult-child interaction or adult interaction with children. And I would add one more. I can't think of a good word for it other than pseudoscientific. There's this great anecdote that Matthews tells about a fourth grader asking him, so you can help me, Megan. He says, can you tell me what my children are thinking, like how my fourth graders think? Because you're the expert, Maybe expert's the right word. And Matthew says, here's this guy, he's been with these kids almost a full school year. He's been interacting with all year, and he's asking me how they think, how their minds work. So I think that's another one, like sort of using some kind of expert system to interpret, to impose on what our interactions with children, automatically interpret what children are saying in terms of stage theory or whatever theory we're using. I think Matthews says, just talk to children and see, just ask them yourself. And I think this goes back to the developmental question. I had one of my best high school literature teacher just said, you should read whatever you want to read. And if you get to the end of a book and you've only understood about half of it, good for you. And I think that's in terms of developmental appropriateness, that's what we do. Let's jump in with children, see what they're interested in, philosophize, and they will let us know if they're able to make meaning of it, if they're able to make sense of it, and if it means anything to them, and if it's worthwhile to them. If we avoid phoniness, condescension, scientific or sentimentality, and quasi-expertise.
And I think one of the things that our panel has highlighted too, which relates to this point, I don't know if you'd agree, Maughn, is we're able to do that with children. We're able to just kind of dive in and find ourselves where we're at, because we're circling back all the time. Like the concepts that we have are concepts that we have in childhood, in adolescence, in adulthood, in old age. I mean, they kind of expand and contract, and there are new ones introduced and old ones perhaps fall by the wayside. But a lot of the concepts with which we live by are essential and there throughout. And we're constantly coming back to them and working out, what do we mean by them? Is this an example? Is this a paradigm? Is this, maybe it means this, maybe friendship does allow for this or that. I think that's such a profound insight that Matthews has. That, I mean, I think Plato had it. I mean, I think maybe Socrates had it too. So it's been there from the beginnings of philosophy, but I'm not sure it's been translated into contexts in which children are actually, where children are, whether that be the family or the school.
Just let me jump in and just say thanks. Another thing that we learned, that Matthews advocated that children's philosophy be published, like in adult venues, which was Jana's journal questions that she was founding, was, I think, one of the first to do that. So important.
And you know, I was going to comment on when Jana read the dialogue about the friendship, the issue in the friendship. I was thinking, this is children's philosophy being published. Like, it was just one of those beautiful moments where I thought, you know, now this is here for the world to read and think about.
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of the idea, right? I mean, listening to the two of you made me think of two different things. One, so I like your list, Maughn, of the kind of vices that we should avoid in our interactions with children, and I especially like phoniness, because I think that is such a huge one, and I think Gary did a really nice job of kind of articulating that. But I guess I would also add that there are some positive attributes that we should strive for, and one of them is trust. Because one of the things that I find in my interactions with kids, particularly in classrooms, is to trust that the kids will take the conversation where they want to take it. And often I think that's so antithetical to the classroom culture, particularly in elementary schools, where it is totally not up to the children to take whatever the dialogue is, where they want to take it. It's actually already been decided for them where it should go. And being able to trust, even when I'm listening and I'm thinking, where is this going? I am not sure this is going in a place that's going to kind of be okay, but to give it some space and really trust that the children, not that I don't have a role to play in helping to facilitate that, but that I need to be very careful about how I play that role, because I really do want it to be their space. And that does require trust, that just like I would trust adults to have the conversation in the way that works for that group. And the other thing it made me think about, I think when you were talking, Megan, about the sort of, you know, this idea that we come back to these same paradigms. And so it's not like we're in totally different worlds when we interact with children about philosophical concepts, is why is it that we seem to forget what it's like to live in childhood? That kind of reconnecting with that in a really fundamental way, so that we're not just, as you said, I think, just there helping the children along or playing the role of the adult teacher, advisor, whatever, but we're in it with them in the same way that we were when we were children. That seems like that's so hard for us to do. And even though we idealize childhood and we sentimentalize childhood, we feel very far away from it. And I hear this from my undergraduate students. I mean, it's not even like you have to be, you know, an older adult. You can be 20 and you feel this way. So why, so it makes me wonder about that. What is it about our culture and our socialization and our experiences that lead us at some point to just kind of move out of childhood, at least emotionally or in the way we think about it, in this very kind of severe way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a mystery, like that remains unsolved. You know, I think people have attempted to offer accounts of why it is that we do that, none of which I find satisfying. But I don't have an answer. I think it has. I was interacting with an 18-month-old. So this 18-month-old yesterday was just learning language. And I spent an hour and a half, you know, interacting with the child on Zoom. And I noticed in myself this battle between wanting to interact with her genuinely, because I didn't really know her. This is the only second time I've met her. But also feeling myself playing that role and drawing attention to things that I assumed she would find, you know, responding to her incredible cuteness. I mean, that's part of it, I'm sure, the physical. But one of the things I was thinking about is I think what makes it hard is the weight we give experience as human beings in general, like, and in culture, and like, it's so, yeah, that was something that, like, finding that point of connection was so hard given her limited experience in the world and what I felt to be my extensive experience of the world by comparison, even though it isn't. And so I think that's part of it. And I think the other part of it that maybe accounts for the fact that we also feel kind of alienated from people at the other end too, is the sense that they live in the world in a relationship of profound dependency. Sorry about the sirens. I don't know, that I mean, I'm speculating. I really don't know. I think it's I just think it's an incredible, it's just a mystery.
Your description of your interaction with the 18-year-old just makes me wonder, like, how do we delight in where that child is without placing on it all these, you know, adult infrastructure and teaching, but at the same time be ourselves with all our experience? How do we do that? I think it's very complicated.
I think one clue Matthews gives us is this idea of perplexity.
Mm-hmm.
To rediscover that, because it just comes through in almost everything he wrote, his utter delight in perplexity. He was not intimidated. He was not, you know, it didn't make him feel inadequate. I think a lot of us, part of the comfort of growing up was being less perplexed or baffled by fewer things in life.
Maybe for you, Maughn, I don't know.
Yeah, you're right about certain things. But of course, we're always perplexed. But I mean, the attitude toward perplexity, you know, to see children delight in it. And of course, a lot of my deepest personal philosophical journeys in life have not been delightful, you know, have been full of angst and fear and anxiety and dread, I would say. So it struck me reading Matthews just almost always talk about it as a delight, that it's not always a delight, but but the value of it, there even in the dread, there's something precious about being able to be perplexed and knowing that you don't know the answer. And I think that that's an important connection anyway, to reconnecting with childhood, is our ability to be vulnerable to perplexity, deep philosophical perplexity.
That relates to a question. That relates to a question that was just brought up in the chat, actually, and on the forum as well. Is this idea that teachers are taught, and this was Wendy's response, teachers are taught that they can understand children completely by putting them in boxes at developmental levels, not the real Piaget, but the educator's simplistic version thereof. I think that one of the observations, scroll up real quick, from Marilyn, the problem is that teachers don't get enough or any training in how to promote critical thinking or philosophy with children. They don't know what to say, and they feel they must control the situation. And I can tell you, in the professional development that I've done with teachers, I can't emphasize that enough. And I think, Maughn, that speaks to your point of being open to perplexity. And as a teacher, being willing to give up that control, as Marilyn was just talking about. And it's okay not to have all the answers, and to allow yourself to be perplexed by the questions that students raise. Yeah, I just think that that's pretty beautiful.
That raises like all these big issues about the purpose of education, right? Because the content delivery model says that the purpose is to put all these facts and information into children's head. I always say to teachers, just because you're up there talking doesn't mean anyone's learning anything, but you can feel as if, now I've done something, right? I've accomplished something, even if in fact it's illusory.
Yeah.
But I agree with everything everyone said, but I also think if we're really going to support teachers in inquiry-based learning, we have to change the conditions under which most teachers are teaching. I mean, when you've got 30 students in a classroom and they're there for 45 minutes and the bell's going to ring and they're coming in and they're going out, I mean, this is just not conducive to being open to perplexity and being able to. So the rhythms of schools and the material conditions under which schooling takes place, I think there's so much work for all of us there if we're really going to support teachers in, I'm sure, engaging in the way they do to engage, which is, spending time with and getting to know and helping, their charges along in the journey of life. It's just, I think it's a real, we almost ask the impossible of teachers. I happen to think it's.
I will not disagree. I will not disagree with that statement, Megan. I will not disagree with that at all. So I do want to just quickly answer two of the questions that were in the Google Forms, and one of they're both sort of calling us out. And the first question is, were any children invited to this webinar? And I can answer yes. I invited all of my students to attend this webinar.
Students too.
Yeah. So the answer to that is a resounding yes. And then the second was a question about what we do, and I'm not sure if it was directed directly to the organization. One was, I think one wasn't, to incorporate the voices of children and young adults and older adolescents into the construction, into what we do with philosophy for children, into the construction of lessons, into the construction of materials and resources that we provide to teachers. And I would just direct you again to questions, which was mentioned in the chat, that we're very proud of the journal that we have that highlights the work of children and young adults. And Wendy Turgeon, I saw her, she's in here as well. She is our current editor, so thank you so much for joining us. And we're also in the process of developing at PLATO what we're calling a Young Leaders Pipeline to achieve just that, to incorporate more young voices in the development of our decision-making as board members of the organization. So we are attuned to listening to our own lessons and listening to our own advice. So here's a question for the three of you. And I'm choosing the intergenerational question first. Do you have any experience? Do you have any experience in intergenerational philosophical dialogue? And how do you think you would convince the adult world to sit down and dialogue with children on equal terms?
I mean, I can say that our center does events several times a year outside of the pandemic for families where children and adults interact. So we run a kind of a community of inquiry. And at least in my experience, you don't really have to convince anyone. It kind of happens. I mean, there's a conversation and children and adults participate, and both are listening to each other and are engaged in this sort of, I think it is kind of a reciprocal mutual respect. I can't remember the phrase I used, but Gary's phrase, but it really is an environment of mutual respect, and where sometimes adults are surprised by the depth of what the children have to say, and sometimes they're not surprised, but they're always, at least in my experience, really open to listening to what each other are contributing. So I think it's creating the spaces more than anything else. We live in such an age stratified world that often we just don't have the opportunity for people to talk across generations. I don't know. Do you have experience with that, Megan or Maughn?
Yeah, I really agree with your last point, because I was thinking, I have experience philosophizing with children, and I have experience philosophizing with adolescents and adults. But it's, it's not too often that I'm philosophizing with adults and children, like together in the one moment. And the only times I can think about, and even that wasn't together, but sometimes in the past, to demonstrate the philosophical depth of children's conversation and power, we would have adults discuss a selection from one of the IEPC novels, and then invite them to watch a video of children discussing the same selection. And, adults would always be kind of a little, because there's a certain kind of presumption when adults do philosophy that this is something that adults do. So when they see children doing it so well and so powerfully, they're a little shocked. But no, I can't think of too many occasions where it's been a community of adults and a community of children or adolescents.
I haven't been involved in that many either of the kind you're describing. But I think it's important to point out that most often when Gareth Matthews wrote about intergenerational philosophical dialogue, he was talking about grandparents and their grandchildren, or parents and their children, usually around a great children's book or story. And I think children's literature, there's a lot of crap out there. I'm really, but there's so much great stuff out there also. When I go to a children's section, I'm just amazed at how amazing some of the stuff is and how terrible, in my view, a lot of the stuff is. But Gareth's work on philosophy and children's literature, I think, is really important, and it's an easy way that to initiate intergenerational philosophical dialogue. And I think it's also a way for adults, as we were talking about earlier, for adults to recapture and that kind of perplexity, that vulnerability, perplexity. But here's an adult author of a children's book who obviously trusts, this goes back to trust, right? Who knows what children are capable of and trusts children to deal with these issues and talk about them. As Megan and I were saying in the book, that they're actually precursors. A lot of the, like Frank Baum and Lewis Carroll, a lot of these children's authors were precursors to philosophers of childhood because they recognized the children do think this way and do have these questions and are capable of doing it. So I think that's an important tool. And I'll just put a plug in for Jana's wonderful website at the University of Washington Center on children's literature with a lot of children's books and how they go philosophical. And the IPC has another one. We can share those links. It's a really important resource.
There's also one at the Prindle Institute too, which was Tom Wartenberg's former website, which is really great also.
That's right.
This question fascinates me. Have either of you asked the children that you work with what they think adults can learn from them? So how would children answer the question, what can adults learn from us?
That's a nice question.
It is.
I love that question.
I don't know that I've ever had exactly that conversation. I mean, I've had the conversation about what are the differences between children and adults, and would you become an adult right now if you could, and you know, those kinds of. And there's a chapter on childhood in my book that kind of talks about some of these conversations that I've had with kids. And one really interesting conversation about who's more trustworthy, adults or kids, where several of the kids say, well, you know, everyone thinks adults are more trustworthy. But actually, I remember one kid said something like, but actually, when you think about it, adults can't keep secrets. And they're really not as trustworthy in some ways as children. And so, yeah, but that would be a really interesting question to ask.
Would you all do me a favor? And if you do, ask your group of kids that you work with, children that you work with, that question. Will you let me know what their answers are? PLATO would love to, PLATO would love to hear the answers to that. One more question. We're going to go a little bit over time, but these questions are really good. So I hope everyone is okay with going just a little bit over time. Does the perspective of childhood change, and therefore the relationship between adult and child, in the context of war, underdevelopment, and social conflict, such as that experienced, for example, in countries like Colombia? And does this change the perspective of philosophy with children? Heavy question.
I think it's an important question. It's a question that Maughn and I grappled with on and off in writing the book, because I think it's important to acknowledge that there are different childhoods, and how does a philosophy of childhood acknowledge that there are these different culturally, politically, economically, historically. I mean, we've done a lot of work, people have done a lot of work studying the history of childhood. I don't know if we got very far with it, Maughn. That's my...
Well, and I myself haven't been in that situation, living in a quite a privileged context. I know of colleagues who run Philosophy for Children programs in refugee camps, including one of the southern border of the United States with Mexico. And my sense is that, for one thing, what we talked about in terms of phoniness and condescension and sentimentality sort of drop away, that those sort of fall away in adult-child relationships in those contexts. And because children are taking on a lot more of what are considered adult responsibilities in those contexts, they are actually consulted more, trusted more, talked to as equals, as human beings of equal benefit and value more, which I think would make a philosophical encounter more meaningful. But apart from that, that's about all I can say to that question.
It makes me wonder too, are there things that children are owed while being in childhood that can be lost to them in certain living circumstances or national circumstances in crisis, etc. And how do we, I mean, I'm thinking of like the UN Charter on Children's Rights, and what are the things that we owe to children, which is a huge question, obviously. But
is your sense, Jana, that this is important work that's beginning to happen now? Like philosophers now are beginning to think about the goods of childhood, or at least trying to identify them. And is your, I feel a sense of excitement that there's at least serious, that philosophers at least, I mean, maybe only professional philosophers, but there are professional philosophers now kind of taking that question seriously and really trying to work through.
yeah, I mean, I think the child studies movement has been really a force in pushing many disciplines to start looking at and thinking about children and childhood in very differently than was true before. I mean, even though philosophers are sort of mostly left, seems like they're left out of child studies, that's starting to change, I think, because there are philosophers who are really starting to put the philosophical lens on some of the questions that have been taken up by sociologists and psychologists and other people who have been really prominent in the child studies movement. Do you think that's true, Maughn?
Yeah, I do. I think it's just beginning though. I think we've got a long way to go. I know that Gareth was concerned about the little he wrote about children's rights. He was also concerned that not be that we not foist on children responsibilities that, as you said, would be a detriment to them. Yeah. And again, like developmentally inappropriate, but not in the sort of biologically essentializing way that Piaget and others thought about it, but just in terms of experience and language use and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, everyone, this was an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Megan, Jana, Maughn, for giving your time and chatting with one another and letting us listen in. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. So I am going to turn it back to Debbie right now, who is going to just kind of go over a few other housekeeping things like making the recording available and all of that sort of stuff. So Debbie, would you mind? Hello.
Hi, that was such a wonderful discussion. Thank you all so much for your time and for sharing all of this amazing wisdom and your work and leaving us with so much to think about. The questions are unbelievable. We have had so many great questions, and I got a lot of responses in the chat about wanting to see the questions. So I just wanted to let you all know that we will be sending a follow-up email after this event, and we will make sure to include in that email the recording. So give us a couple of days to get that set up. We will send you the recording. We will send you as well, I have a nice list of things, information for how to buy the books that these wonderful panelists have recently published. And there will also be a really short evaluation of the event. We will also send you the questions that you all so thoughtfully put together today in our form, as well as the links that I think Maughn and Jana, you all mentioned for resources. So I'll make sure all of that is here for you in one place, so don't worry about it. Our panelists have been really gracious and are willing to share their emails. So if you would like to write to them for any sort of follow-up, that is most certainly possible. So if you give me a second, I will put that in the chat for you, but that information will also be on the follow-up email. So thank you all for joining us. Panelists, thank you so much. That was wonderful. Allison, thank you so much for moderating. That was great. And a special shout out to Kate, who was doing all of the managing of Zoom behind the scenes. And to thank you all for coming out this evening for such a wonderful event. This turnout has been amazing. And I hope to see you all at a future Plato event in the not too distant future. So have a good night, you all, and look for that follow-up email very soon from us.
Thank you, Plato.
3 a.m. in Saudi Arabia. Thank you for joining. That's pretty amazing. Thank you all so much.
We've had people from all over the world join in, and that's fabulous.